Joined now live from Tel Aviv by international affairs expert Tom Gross. Tom, thank you so much for being with us. So, to start off, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu paid an official visit to both Palestine and Israel this week. So how are you evaluating these critical visits in terms of improving bilateral ties between Turkey and Israel?
Well, I think it's definitely a very important step. Just to remind people, to put it in historical context, until about 15 years ago, Israel and Turkey enjoyed very close relations, economically, but also in terms of security, intelligence, defense cooperation, and so on. In fact, Turkey was the first majority Muslim country to recognize Israel after Israel declared independence in 1948, a few months later. But in the last dozen or so years, political ties have been very bad and almost frozen, even though, in fact, economic ties between Israel and Turkey have grown in that period. But for various geostrategic reasons, the Turkish government seems eager to restore good political and security ties with Israel, although at the same time they're reiterating that this would not change their stance on the Palestinian issue, which is why when the Turkish Foreign Minister arrived yesterday in Israel, he went straight from Tel Aviv airport to Ramallah in the West Bank, where he met the Palestinian President Abbas and the Palestinian Foreign Minister. And it's only today that he met the Israeli Foreign Minister and is dealing with Israeli government officials. Usually when foreign dignitaries come to Israel, they usually meet the Israelis first, and then the second day they visit Ramallah. But it was the reverse this time.
So, Turkish decision makers reiterate that at every opportunity, the denormalization between the two nations will not be at the cost of the Palestine cause. So how do you think this visit will contribute to peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians in particular?
Well, I'm not sure it will contribute in any specific ways. There's one thing that Israel very much wants, which is that the Turkish government stops support for Hamas, which of course is not the same as the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah in the West Bank. Hamas ruled Gaza and a more Islamist movement, which Israel regards as a terrorist organization. And Hamas have some of their leaders based in Turkey, and Israel says they plan terror attacks on Israelis from their offices in Turkey. And Israel, and indeed the Palestinian Authority too, have urged the Turkish government to stop being so close to Hamas. But that's not the same as the Palestinian issue and the two-state solution. Turkey will remain close to the Palestinian Authority, which, as I said, is why he went to Ramallah yesterday, and immediately said also that the Turks would construct a new industrial zone in the West Bank Palestinian town of Jenin, and they signed some other, I think, agricultural and trade and educational agreements with the Palestinian Authority. But in an overall way, this visit is very much about restoring Turkish-Israeli ties. It's not about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And of course, that is in the context of the fact that in the last 2 or 3 years, Israel has established diplomatic relations with a number of other Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. And Israel has also grown closer to countries with which it doesn't officially have relations, like Saudi Arabia, but unofficially they are now quite close to the Israelis and Saudis. So for various reasons, Turkey also decided to let's say, warm up relations, not just with Israel, but also with the Saudis and UAE and others recently.
Now, my next question actually relates to that. When contextualizing this, and you talked about how relations, they have gotten better recently, and they used to be even good 10 years ago. Considering this diplomatic dialogue that Turkey is engaging in with Israel, while still keeping the Palestine issue at its core and still supporting them, What do you think? What kind of what can other Muslim majority countries take from this? And perhaps what would you or Israel like to see which countries to engage the same way with Israel diplomatically or economically, while they may have their disagreements on the Palestine issue?
Well, in theory, Turkey could play a very important role in mediating a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. Look, there are only three non-Arab major powers in the Middle East: Israel, Turkey, and Iran. The Iranian regime is very hostile to Israel, and Turkey could play a very important role. Turkey has one foot in the West, one foot in the Middle East. It's an ally of America. It's a NATO country. It has good ties with the Palestinians, and Turkey could play an important role in this. The problem from an Israeli point of view is that it's one thing for Turkey to be close to Fatah, to the Palestinian Authority. It's another thing for Turkey to be close to Hamas. Another problem is that over the last dozen or so years, the Turkish president, Erdogan, has lashed out at Israel at various times and used some pretty hostile language. So there's a little bit of suspicion there in Israel towards the Turkish president. Obviously, Israel does want reconciliation with Turkey, and indeed on a human level, Israelis and Turks are quite close. Turkey is the #1 tourist destination for Israelis, and Istanbul is the #1 city that Israeli tourists visit to. There are, I think, dozens of flights a day. As I mentioned before, trade, in spite of the political frostiness, I think that both Israel and Turkey are within the top 10 trading partners of each other. Then you have problems, resulting from the Ukrainian-Russian war. So both Turkey and Israel have working relations with the Russians and the Ukrainians. They both obviously are close to America. Obviously, Turkey's in NATO, Israel is not in NATO, but Israel is close to many NATO countries. So in a way, Israel and Turkey could be natural allies as they were in the past, and Turkey could win the confidence of Israel to play a brokerage role with the Palestinians. But that's a little way off for the time being, but certainly down the road, I don't see why Turkey shouldn't play a constructive role in trying to broker a Israeli-Palestinian agreement.
Indeed. My last question. The Eastern Mediterranean has become a center of attraction with its geostrategic importance and energy resources in recent years. And many experts said that the estimated natural gas transfer cost would be 3 times cheaper if the pipeline passes through Turkey. So can you evaluate the latest developments from the view of the energy geopolitics?
Well, the Israeli and Turkish foreign ministers concluded a press conference a couple of hours ago in Jerusalem. And what was interesting is neither foreign minister mentioned this energy issue in the press conference. They also didn't mention an exchange of ambassadors, because it was anticipated that Turkey and Israel would once again send ambassadors to each other's, well, in Israel's case, Tel Aviv and Ankara. So with the energy issue, I think there is potential there, but Israel doesn't immediately want to warm up to Turkey. They're just waiting to see that Turkey, it's a sustainable bridge building with Turkey. That's one thing. The other thing is that in the last decade, while Turkey has been fairly hostile, or the government's been fairly hostile to Israel, Greece and Greek Cyprus have become much closer allies with Israel as a result. So Israel is trying to balance its now good relations with Greece and Cyprus and those with Turkey. So I think in the longer term, yes, there is definitely energy cooperation there, especially given what's happening with Russia and Western countries basically turning their back on Russian energy supplies. But that wasn't mentioned in public on this visit. This is an initial visit that may still wait for a further visit, possibly at the level of energy ministers or possibly at a head of state. Or rather, sorry, not head of state, because the Israeli president, who doesn't actually wield the real power, already visited Turkey recently, but I mean the Israeli Prime Minister Bennett with the Turkish president. So, so far, no mention of any energy deals, and no mention of any exchange of ambassadors.
All right, Tom Gross, thank you so much for taking out the time to give us your insight and analysis on this. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.